Hello and welcome to this podcast on the English and Welsh legal system with Ryan Murphy. Today we are going to talk about the features of a statutory instrument, so the features of secondary legislation, of delegated legislation. This is an important source of law in the English and Welsh legal system, and a great volume of statutory instruments are passed each year. And whatever level of study you end up doing of the English and Welsh legal system, it's important that you can recognise, identify, and use the various features of statutory instruments and of delegated legislation to inform your understanding of the law and of how that law is made. And so on the screen now, you can see some of the major features of statutory instrument. There'll be the SI number, the subject matter, the title, the date it's made, the date it's laid, the date it's coming into force, the preamble, the rules or paragraphs or regulations, the signature and the explanatory notes. And the purpose of this short podcast is just to run you through those to give you an idea of what a statutory instrument looks like. And at the very end, there's an activity for you to go away to look up a particular statutory instrument and to see if you can locate those features that we're going to discuss now. And so with no further delay, let's get on and do it. So the regulations that I've chosen to focus on, I've chopped them up, are the Social Security Coronavirus Prisoners Regulations of 2020. And so this was just a randomly selected, very, very recent, at the time of recording at least, statutory instrument. I could have chosen any statutory instrument. They all share, particularly regulations, share a common structure and have common features. And so what you can do, if you like, is to go to legislation.gov.uk and search through the vast back catalogue of statutory instruments. So let's make a start. The first thing that you can see is the statutory instrument number, the SI number. So this particular statutory instrument was the 409th statutory instrument of 2020. So at the very top, very center of the printed version of the instrument will be its number, and that will help you locate it and distinguish it from other statutory instruments that might have very, very similar names. The next aspect that you can see on the screen highlighted is the subject matter of the SI. So in this case, the subject matter is Social Security. And so there are broad headings used so that those who work in a particular area or who have particular interests can quickly garner and understand whether a particular statutory instrument is relevant to them and whether it will be of interest to them. So that might say something like taxation in another SI, but here we're talking about Social Security. The next you can see is the title or citation of the statutory instrument. So here we can see that these are the Social Security open brackets coronavirus close brackets open brackets prisoners close brackets regulations of 2020. Those that title is there to give you some insight into what the statutory instrument is about, and will help you is searching for relevant statutory instruments. And given the proliferation of statutory instruments regulations that we expect to come about as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, you could search coronavirus and find through the title, all of the regulations and statutory instruments that were passed in order to deal with coronavirus. So let's turn our attention a little bit further down. You can still see the SI number, you can still see the subject area, you can still see the title of citation. And then below those, you will see a list of 3 dates. There aren't always 3 dates, but in this case there are. The date on which the regulations were made. So the date on which they were made by, in most instances, a minister of government. So here we can see that these were made on the 7th of April 2020, and they were made, slightly unusual to include a time, but they were made at 10:23. What you will notice then is a date laid, and these are the date in which the instrument is formally laid in Parliament. It's laid on the desks at the centre of Parliament. So here we can see that the laid date is 3 p.m. on the 7th of April. And this is quite interesting and fairly unusual and atypical in terms of statutory instruments. Normally parliamentary procedure requires a statutory instrument to be laid before it is made. So it's laid, and then depending on the process, whether Parliament votes or just time passes, will determine when the statutory instrument can go from being in draft to being made. Here, because this was emergency legislation, it was possible for the minister to make the legislation, so it's made at 10:30 on the 7th of April, and then it's laid at 3 o'clock on the same day, so later that day. It's quite unusual to have a piece of secondary legislation that is made before it is laid. And this is why actually pulling apart a statutory instrument and its features can be really helpful. The more you look at, the more familiar you'll become with the terminology, and the easier you will find it to navigate some of the aspects of it. And then finally, you will have a date on which it has come into force. And you can see that it was made on the 7th and then came into force the next day. So those 3 dates are fairly important: when it was made by the relevant minister, when it was laid before Parliament for whatever process Parliament has to go through for that particular measure, and then finally when it came into force. Moving on then to the next important aspect. This is quite long on the screen, but please don't worry about it. This is the preamble, or the authority to act. And so where a minister is making regulations, a form of statutory instrument, there will be a parent act, an act of Parliament that allows him or her to make this piece of secondary legislation. So secondary legislation, regulations, statutory instruments derive their power from an act of Parliament. So an act of Parliament will give powers to a minister to pass certain laws. And here, at the very start of the Act, under where you can see when it was laid, when it was made, and when it comes into force, you will be able to find the authority from which the minister derives the power to pass the particular piece of secondary legislation. So here we can see that aspects of this Act, aspects of this statutory instrument, the power to pass them were derived from the Social Security Contributions and Benefits Act, some from the Job Seekers Act, some from the State Pension Credit Act, etc., etc. And so it's very, very easy to trace the legal authority of the minister to pass the statutory instrument right back to its source, which will be an Act of Parliament. And then the second pink arrow pointing downwards, where a piece of legislation requires, so a parent act requires the Secretary of State, so the minister, to take into account certain things before they act, you will often find that stated on the face of the secondary legislation. So you can see that in accordance with section 176(2)(a) of the Social Security Administration Act of 1992, it appears to the Secretary of State that by reason of the urgency of this matter, it is inexpedient to consult with representative bodies. So we know from reading that normally when passing this sort of measure, the Secretary of State has a duty to consult with particular representative bodies. And we know that that Social Security Administration Act also therefore contains a get out for him or her. And so what we have here is a sort of a pathway to how this legislation came about. How did this piece of secondary legislation come about? What are the powers that led to it? And you can find that right at the start of the Act in the preamble or the authority to act sections. Then if we go into the detail of the Social Security coronavirus prisoners, regulations, we can see certain features. So bolded numbers, which in an Act of Parliament would be sections, in a set of regulations, these are called regulations. So the big thing is called regulation. So these are the coronavirus, these are the Social Security coronavirus prisoners regulations. The big whole thing are referred to as regulations. The individual aspects, what would be sections if this were an Act of Parliament, are also termed regulations. So this is regulation 3 of those regulations. And that's the sort of language that we use. If this was an order in council, a different form of secondary legislation, then that bolded number would be referred to as its article. And it's important that you start to get used to this different terminology and how it applies to different sorts of legislation. So in Acts of Parliament, you have sections. In regulations, you have regulations. In orders in council, you have articles. And in books of rules, you have rules. So if we were to cite this particular provision, we would say that it was regulation 3 of the Social Security, etc., regulations. There is also a regulation title that's included for each of the regulations within the set of regulations. And this gives you an indication of what this bit of statutory instrument is trying to achieve. So we can see that this particular one is about income support, and it's about persons as being or not being members of the same household. This is going to have something to do with that because that's what the regulation title tells us. Then if we come towards the end of the statutory instrument, what we will see is a signature. We won't see an actual signature, but what we will see is a recognition, evidence that this has been made on the authority of a particular minister. Here, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, they will be named, and the department to which they belong will also be recorded on the secondary legislation. And this is useful for tracing who is responsible for the delegated legislation and which department the delegated legislation stemmed from, emerged from. And then finally, you have an explanatory note. Those explanatory notes can be quite lengthy, they can be quite short. They are not formally part of the statutory instrument. So they are aside from, different to, and separated from the main regulations. They are there to provide a layman's explanation, a basic everyday explanation of what these regulations are trying to achieve. You can imagine that some regulations are very, very technical. They are very, very complex. They make amendments to other legislation, whether that's primary or secondary. And what the explanatory note is supposed to do, it's not binding law, but it's supposed to give an indication of what the government was trying to do. What was the minister trying to do when they passed this piece of secondary legislation? So we can see from the outset, these regulations make provision for individuals on temporary release from prison due to the outbreak of COVID-19 in Great Britain to access means-tested benefits during the period of that release. So you have a very simplified statement of what these regulations are trying to achieve. And if you go down through it, it will give an explanation of what different powers are contained within those regulations. And it can be really, really useful if you are struggling with a particular set of regulations, really struggling to understand what they're trying to say. If you just go to the explanatory notes, sometimes these can be quite insightful in gaining a better understanding of what the regulations were trying to achieve. And that's all that I wanted to cover in this brief podcast, was just to start you thinking, to get you really familiar with some of the terminology that you will come across in any level of study of the English legal system. And it's important that you start to understand what that terminology is, that you can use it correctly and with confidence. That will make your studies much, much easier. Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I will speak to you next time. Goodbye.